The glory of humanity is the differentiation, individuality of each person, and the fact that each individual is unique and irreplaceable, which makes each individual precious.
I'd like to talk to you this afternoon about two classes of Americans, and it may not be the two classes you think of, but nonetheless, there are two distinct classes in America, and we have to break up.
You don't get freedom peacefully. Anyone who is depriving you of freedom isn't deserving of a peaceful approach.
We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being by any means necessary.
Welcome to the Unrestrained Thoughts Podcast, a Utah-based program that focuses on ideas, politics, culture, and the current events going on in the world around us, whether locally or globally. I'm your host, David Iglesias. All right, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Unrestrained Thoughts Podcast. I'm David Iglesias, your host, and today I have another fantastic guest here for you guys. This is Quinn Driggs. Quinn, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I am really good. I'm really excited for this. I'm really excited to meet you and have you on because turns out we're both from Utah. We're both kind of in the same background of getting into foreign policy stuff and following a lot of the same things. And I had no idea who you were until like a month ago. And then I reached out just recently. I was like, hey, you want to talk about a piece you just wrote? And so here we are. Why don't you go ahead and give people a little bit of your backstory? Tell them, how did you get to where you are? What is it you're even talking about? What are you interested in? And what are you currently doing and living? Because that's another interesting part.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I'm Quinn. I'm 23, turned 23 yesterday.
Happy birthday.
I'm from kind of all over, born in Vegas, lived in Utah, lived in Idaho, lived in South America, lived in a couple different countries, love to travel. It's a big part of my life. And I basically kind of where my story, I feel like when it comes to politics begins, is I've always been interested in politics. Always been really, really deeply interested in the Constitution, in the history of the American Revolution and all that type of stuff. That's like my favorite era of history. So that's been how I've been since I can remember, like 13, 14, always been a history buff.
That's awesome.
Big nerd, big reader, big nerd, never did anything in school except for study, didn't play any sports or anything. And I grew up pretty religious. I grew up Mormon. And so also had a big fascination in religion. And so with that, when I was 15, I was kind of just reading more like religious pieces and things like that, learning more about like biblical history, Abraham, etc. And I came across like a 40-page essay talking about Islam. And up until then in my life, I was living in Idaho, so I literally never met anyone from the Middle East, never really learned anything about Islam. I can remember like one class period in 7th grade where they talked about Islam, and that was it. Like that's the extent of my knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. And I grew up always thinking that Islam was a super foreign religion, had nothing to do with anything that I knew or understood in my life. So when I came across this article and I read and I started to understand that Islam, its roots go back to Abraham, and it's kind of like a trio, like cousin religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Right. I thought that was fascinating. And being Mormon, and I'm still an active Mormon, and so I'm still fascinated by religion and those types of things. I just kind of became obsessed with that aspect of it, and learning about the religiosity of things and the theology. And I started to understand actually a lot of parallels between Mormonism specifically and Islam. And that was really fascinating to me. So that's kind of where things really started. And the more I started to learn, I kind of just started to realize how wrong I had been and how wrong I was taught. And that kind of just started to open up my mind a little bit to just as a 15-year-old, oh, things aren't actually what they may seem. And things aren't actually black and white. And there's actually a big world out there that you don't know anything about. And I don't know, something just really shifted in me at that time. And I just became obsessed. And I think I became obsessed because I didn't know anything before and I was bothered by that. And everything that I did know seemed to be wrong and actually not truthful when it comes to like, what is the Middle East? What is Islam? What is this religion that we hear about on the news that's so mistaken and perverted in the way that we speak about it, right?
Right.
And so I started off with the theology aspect of things, getting into Abraham, stuff like that. And then that kind of turned into me wanting to know more about like the politics of it. I got pretty fascinated with like the Islamic radicalism aspect of it as well, learning about origins of Qaeda and things like that. So I kind of just went on every level that I could. I just became obsessed wholly with the Middle East in general. So when I graduated school, I knew that I wanted to study Middle East and Arabic. So I went to BYU for a year and dove right into my classes there. Spent a year at BYU. Wasn't loving it, wasn't loving school very much. As much as I love to learn and I'm a good student, I don't do well with like the structure of school.
Right. Weird how college education isn't quite the bastion of learning.
Exactly. That's exactly how I felt. And that's how I felt in high school too. Like I always learned better through experience, hands-on. Like I'm meant for an apprenticeship. I am not meant for school.
Right.
So plus I had found that everything that I was reading outside of school was what was actually teaching me something. Whereas what I was learning in school, I felt like I wasn't learning that much. So went to BYU for a year, like I said, and then I ended up moving to Italy for a couple months. I needed a hiatus from my life. And it was there that I was like, you know what, screw it. I'm just going to move to the Middle East on my own.
Wow.
And get a hands-on experience, like I said, which I desperately wanted. And I love adventure and doing my own thing. I'm a big loner type person, so I don't mind doing my own thing on my own. So I just bought like a one-way ticket. I was going to leave in like 6 months from that time. And so I went to live in Jordan in 2019, summer 2019. So I moved to Amman, and yeah, it was there that I took some Arabic classes, things like that. I met somebody who's now my fiance, basically. So I'm back here in Amman. I just moved back like last week. It hasn't even been a week, actually. I think it was last Saturday. So yeah, I lived there for 8 months, and then obviously COVID happened. So I went home to the US, unfortunately. And yeah, I did a little internship here for like religious freedom type stuff. I worked for like a Catholic priest here in Amman for like 8 months, and I did a little bit of stuff with the government here. And when I was here, actually, that's like kind of another thing that was very eye-opening for me, was working on projects with something called the National Democratic Institute here, which is ran by the Democrats in the Senate. And there's a one for Republicans as well. And you just start to see like how intricately involved the US government is in just like local Jordanian politics. And you're just like, what? Like, I remember telling my family back home, just like, yeah, you guys want to know like all the things that we fund randomly in Jordan? Like, it's just, it's crazy. And it really just goes to show like what an empire we are, you know? And that was kind of like my first wake up. And then also my fiance works for them. So that's actually how we met. So we're always just kind of laughing and talking about like, what the heck is our government? Like, what, I don't understand. I was working on a project, and just seeing also just like the waste of funds as well. Like, not to be rude, but it's just an absolute disaster of like wasting funds here. I worked on a project for the Institute, and we were working on like a little conference for talking about voting rights for persons with disabilities in Jordan, which is all fine and great. Love that, you know, that's awesome. You want to talk about democracy, all these things, but why is the US funding it? You know, and how big of a difference did this conference actually make, and how much of that money was really truly wasted or corrupted in between. And just the whole thing was very eye-opening for me.
Yeah.
And that's also when I realized I never wanted to work for the government, because up until that time I was like, you know what, maybe I'll do like a State Department job or, you know, something like that. But then I just realized, you know, if I ever want to make a difference, working inside government probably isn't the place for me.
Right.
So
No, you're too caught up with all the money, you know, the US has got to secure those elections, make sure that they're really democratic and really fair in the way that they outcome or favor the US outcome. That's
right.
that's fascinating. So this one wild how this one-way ticket to Jordan just completely changed your life. Like not only just
Yeah.
experiencing all the new things that you did, learning a new language, getting to see the insides of, I mean, I was just thinking, you pick a random country in the Middle East and you just go get involved. And then sure enough, local government, look at that, the US pops up. Like you
Yeah.
can't escape your
Yeah.
home country. It's like you
No,
said.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, sorry, I
Yeah.
don't mean to cut you off. Keep going.
No, you're fine. No, it's true. And so that was just like another eye-opening experience for me as well. And just knowing like the process behind it all, like I just remember being so frustrated with my internship because everything was so slow moving. Everything was just bullshitting the whole time, to be frank. Just saying ideas that just like are so superficial and nothing, and there's no like umph behind it. And you just
Right.
once you see it behind the scenes, I'm just like, wait, because in my head, you know, I grew up with a family who were Republicans, so we claim to be anti-government, yet we like literally think that being a part of the State Department or the CIA is like the coolest thing ever. Or my whole family's like, oh, Quinn, like, yeah, it'll be dope. You can speak Arabic and then you can do work for the CIA, blah, blah. In my head now, I'm like, disgusting. I don't even want to touch that.
Right.
But we have like this like view. I think a lot of Republicans have this view of just like this elite type of government where it's like very cool to like work for them type thing. And
Mhm.
so in my head, that's kind of what I'm thinking too. And then once you're in it, I just feel like it's just like, this is really just, it really is a joke. And everything is so slow moving and nothing actually means anything. And I don't know if that makes sense, but
Oh,
it
no,
was
100%.
very, very eye-opening. So yeah. So that's about me, I guess. And then kind of to quicken it up, came back during the pandemic. I was introduced to like true libertarianism at the end of 2020. I found Dave Rogan. I found Dave Smith on Joe Rogan, and that like episode truly, I guess, really did change my life in another way, because that's when I realized, oh, there's actually is this Libertarian Party out there that actually does stand for something and is good and something I would want to affiliate with. Because until now, like I'd always just considered myself like really truly believed in limited government. I'm still a minarchist, not quite an anarchist yet.
Fair enough.
It's okay, probably get there. So I
Give it
really
6
did
months.
believe in that, and I really did believe in those types of principles, and I really did value like a limited government under the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. So I've always been a libertarian, and I always would actually say like I'm a libertarian, but I'm still a Republican, you know,
Mhm.
until I realized there was another option, and I just hadn't known that there was actually another option. And I
Right.
also hadn't really known how horrible Republicans were up until now. So it took me a little bit,
I
but
think, yeah, I would say I think it takes realizing foreign policy is what, and because for me that's where I've really got to see how ugly the Republican
yes,
Party can be, and I mean also
yeah,
the Democratic Party, and it's funny because the
I feel
Democratic
like that goes
Party.
without being said for me.
Right. No, 100%. It's just like it's funny because you don't once you see, and I think it's fair to say this about every politician, about any party, you can really see what their like actual values and what they really are going to do based off of how they behave and what their views are on the foreign policy. Because it seems like a lot of
Right.
people they say a lot of great things like, hey, we need to take care of the poor and help the needy and do XYZ thing here. We need to secure freedom and rights in our country. But then for whatever reason, they don't hold that consistent overseas. You can go when it comes to overseas conflicts, you can just completely go and destroy the democracy or the election system of another country, but still be like, oh no, I believe in limited government because we're helping
Right.
them. we're making sure that they have a limited government by installing our limited government, which doesn't doesn't really make any sense. But
None of it makes sense. It's so contradictory. And it's just like, how can they not understand the essence of you wanting to go intervene somewhere else means that you therefore do not have a limited government. Like,
right,
those two things cannot actually be true at once. Like, I'm a big person that always says two things can be true at once, but those two things actually cannot be true at once.
right,
You can't be fully intervened in another country and then still call yourself a limited government, because that means that you have these outreaching arms of your bureaucracy, and any type of like unlimited bureaucracy goes to show that you don't have a limited government, if that makes sense.
right.
You
No,
know,
100%.
so the claim in and of itself, just, it doesn't make sense. And so once I also started to like understand that too, and I was like, okay, let me look at my own principles that I claim to have, and do those match up with the US's foreign policy? Absolutely not. Look at foreign policy alone, like you said, and you just immediately know. And that's kind of what started to happen for me, is the more I started to dive into learning about the Middle East, then I started to get really obsessed with just like war itself. And obviously we've been at war in the Middle East for, let me do my math, like really like 40 years, except that we've been intervening since like the 1940s, you know, with Iran and everything like that. But once I started to see that, that's when I couldn't like hold it in anymore, that I started to realize all the holes in the arguments of the political commentators that I would listen to, especially when I started learning about Palestine and things like that. I used to listen to Charlie Kirk, and I'm like, I feel embarrassed to say it because I really just can't stand him at all anymore. And so I remember coming here, and my fiance is Palestinian.
Oh,
and
wow.
so yeah, he's Palestinian Jordanian, but he's Palestinian. Both his parents are from, his mom's from Jerusalem, his dad's from Hebron. So they're Palestinian. And just like being able to just be introduced to one other side of it. And it's nothing I've ever heard before, right? Like the whole narrative of Israel is just so false, so falsely put in the US. Like, it's insane, the level of falsities that there are with that narrative specifically. And just hearing one other side of it, just one time for me to be like, wait, what? Like, I didn't know any of what you're saying. And then that kind of opened my eyes to go down another rabbit hole with that. And so I don't know, I feel like once I was able to just start processing all the holes in the arguments that I was seeing when it came to the Middle East, that really just made me kind of weary and suspicious of all the things that I was learning, even with domestic issues. So yeah, I found Dave Smith end of 2020, and then I heard Scott on his podcast, Scott Horton, and then I became super, super obsessed with Scott. Immediately read all of his books, and his book Enough Already, like, truly is just, there's no better book. I bought a copy for my whole family.
I have done
like
the
right
same
off
thing.
the bat. I gave my brother, who graduated from the Air Force Academy, a copy of it for his graduation present.
Wow. That's awesome. Scott would be proud.
So yeah, and then I've been on Instagram talking about politics on and off for like probably 3 years, but I've gotten a lot more consistent with it in the last year and a half, I'd say, and really just focusing on talking about libertarianism. And I'm fully dedicated to the liberty movement now. I'm fully dedicated to the party. I really want to help them become the new party, become the new option for people, because I feel like we really are at a point right now in the US where there's so many people that would say that they're in the middle, that I guarantee you they're libertarian, as long as if they just could. We're not educated in school correctly. So if only they could just be educated on, like, okay, what should the role of government be in someone's life, rather than just being so distracted by these culture wars all the time. Like, no one's actually just looking at the root of the issue, which is how much do you want government to intervene in your life and how much not, you know? And I feel like the value of what libertarians have to offer is that they can reach people that are socially progressive, and they can reach people that are conservatively fiscal conservatives. You know what I mean? They can reach both sides of the aisle so easily. And it really just comes down to the fact that I have nothing to do with your life. You have nothing to do with mine. All I want to talk about is government intervention in my life. And that's it. You know, and I feel like once we can just kind of hone in and reteach people what government means and what its role should be, and just like the philosophical side of it, I think we can reach so many people. I do really feel like there's so many people as well who are like, I don't affiliate with either party, or they're disoriented with there's so many socialists, like hard left socialists, that are so not happy with Democrats right now. And there's more and more Republicans who maybe are even Trump Republicans that aren't happy with the Republican Party right now, right?
Right.
And so I just feel like there's such an opportunity, and I feel like once my eyes were open, I couldn't close them again, and I just started to realize, like, I truly am a libertarian, and I'm going to vote libertarian. I'm going to make my family libertarians, and so I'm going to make all my friends libertarians. So yeah,
a lifelong mission. Well, and that's interesting. And you know what, we'll have to do another podcast episode talking about something else that you brought to my mind, which is, it'd be really interesting to talk about kind of the culture in Utah, particularly because one thing I feel like I've noticed is that there's these, you have the predominant religion, which is the LDS Church, and then you have a lot of people, especially around our age, in their 20s, 30s, that there's a lot of them that do end up leaving the church, and it's for reasons that are kind of similar to this political feeling of like, just leave me alone. I want to just live my life, because a lot of people, and it's not to say or bash on the church, it's just the culture in Utah particularly has this weird obsessive and really, like, almost, it can be oppressive, it can be very controlling for a lot of people, and so then they get turned off, and I feel like there's kind of a nexus there between people that leave the church and then people in the church that are like, they, it's interesting because the church doctrine is about freedom, and it's about agency and about choosing to do what's right. But when you look at the politics of Utah, it doesn't really translate into the agency aspect. It's very controlling, and so that's
100%.
That's a whole rabbit hole that I think
That's a whole rabbit hole.
we should do another episode and talk about that, because I would love to do that. But I want to talk specifically about an issue that you recently wrote a piece on regarding Yemen, because as far as all the conflicts go that are happening between the US and every other country overseas, whether it's in the Middle East or right now, obviously the big ones, Ukraine and Russia, Yemen, in my opinion, is one of the most tragic, if not the most tragic story that is currently ongoing. And there's actually been some really interesting updates just in the last week that we can get into, but I want to give you a chance to, just lay out a basic framework for people who aren't familiar. We're both trying to relay this message of foreign policy, and I guess people would describe it as non-interventionism, but I would just say non-imperialism. We're trying to relay a simplistic message to help people understand, because the Middle East and foreign policy is just so complex. It doesn't have to be, but it gets really convoluted, and there's so many names, so many places. Most people can't even point to the country that exists on the map. Like, they don't know where it is. They just know we're supposed to be hating these people. So the conflict in Yemen is one of the most horrific and tragic stories. And you wrote a piece on it just last month. So why don't you kind of go over that and explain a little bit of the history, who are the key players, what's the role that the U.S. even why is the U.S. involved in Yemen? So go ahead.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief, but I think that the context is super important. So I'm going to go back a little bit. And this is all, by the way, thanks to Scott Horton and his great work. He's just so good at documenting everything for us. So using him for all the sources and things like that, and putting it out in a way that makes sense. But the U.S. has been involved in Yemen since the Bush administration. So there's something called AQAP in Yemen, which is Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So Al Qaeda actually to this day operates still in Yemen, and it's that specific faction of Al Qaeda, which is AQAP, right? So we were doing some missions back in the Bush administration in Yemen against AQAP there. I'm actually just going to say Al Qaeda there so people can keep track. So we've been involved since the Bush administration, like I said. And then we kind of just outsourced our role there to the Yemeni government to fight Al Qaeda there. And then when Obama came to power in 2009, we kind of stepped up our intervention in Yemen. We started selling weapons to the Yemeni government, particularly the dictator there, who is Abdullah Saleh, I think. Yeah, I have to remember that name. So we started giving him, weapons, money, like just flooding him with weapons and money. And we were doing that so that in exchange, we could run our drone war in Yemen. So Obama, is the infamous like drone king, right? All over the Middle East. His whole administration was all about drone wars. So no troops on the ground.
He was so good, he got a Nobel Peace Prize.
Right, exactly. Makes so much sense. Start 7 wars, get a prize. Awesome. Seems easy enough.
Right.
So yeah, he and of course, like nobody even knows this. Nobody knows that we were doing a drone war in Yemen. And obviously, yes, it is against Al Qaeda, and Al Qaeda actually is America's enemies. We could have a whole separate conversation about how Al Qaeda should have been dealt with, et cetera, history behind that. But overall, I can respect that to an extent because Al Qaeda is the only organization that has actually ever attacked the US,
right?
Even though we go to war with all kinds of people that never have. So we're doing the drone strike war there, and there's so many factors to this. Number one, of course, when it comes to drone strikes, there's a guy named John Kirikou who was a former official for the CIA, and he's quoted talking about how drone strikes or drone wars are like the best recruiting tool for bin Ladenite terrorists, right? Because you go and actually screw up your drone strike and you kill, innocent civilians in this village. And now every person there knows that it's an American that killed their brother or their sister or their wife or their cousin. And they're going to want to take up arms against you, just like I would want to do that to you if you came to Utah and droned my village, even though you didn't mean to. I don't really care because you just killed every person that I love. And I'm pissed, right? So it's the number one recruiting tool. So of course, this drone war is doing the opposite of what it's supposed to do by annihilating Al Qaeda. It's instead creating more support for them and creating more recruits for them to just continue to grow, right? So that's a whole other like side topic, but I just think it's important to note that even if it's justified interventionism or military intervention in a country, it's not military intervention that actually makes a difference. It's truly not, right? It just creates more of an issue. So that's going on. And like I said, we're flooding Yemen with weapons and money to this dictator, Abdullah Saleh. So he is actually taking those money and weapons, and he is taunting and starting his own little like civil strife with a faction called the Houthi in the northern part of Yemen. Yemen is majority Sunni Muslim, right? So there's Sunnis and there's Shia. And the Houthi are Shia Muslims. So they're a different sect or like faction of Islam, right? So he's been having strife with them for like years, maybe decades. And so he's just using, the new money and weapons that we've given him and starting some strifes with them. And of course, that's creating more instability in the country as well. But interestingly, this is where things start to get like kind of twisted and confusing, but it's really not that confusing. And I hope that it's going to make sense when I say it. But this dictator is now using the money and weapons that we gave him, and he's propping up the Muslim Brotherhood in Yemen and Al Qaeda in Yemen because they're fighting for him now against the Houthi faction in the north. So like, what are we doing? I'm confused. So we gave them weapons so that they would allow us to do our drone war there. And now those weapons are going to the hands of the people that we are doing the drone war against.
Makes sense.
This is the problem with trying to intervene in a foreign country because you cannot control the factors on the ground. It's not going to be better if Bush is in charge or Trump's in charge. I don't care who's in charge. You cannot control what's going to happen on the ground. And that's why you simply shouldn't be there in the first place. This is something I wish people would understand, especially Republicans would understand. Because if someone were to hear this, they would just want to blame it on Obama and just make it a partisan thing when it's just truly not. It has to just do with government overreach, and that's it. That's the root of the issue. Like, solve the root, right? So that's what's happening during the Obama administration. Then the Arab Spring arises. And if you don't know what the Arab Spring is, basically, this is a time in the Middle East when a lot of people in countries were rising up against their dictators and, asking for democracy, essentially. It started in Tunisia and it kind of spread across the entire Arab world. So it happened in Yemen as well, and they're sick of their dictator. They want someone new, right? There's 2 assassination attempts on him. And this is when the US and Saudi Arabia kind of saw an opportunity to put their own person in power, right? So Yemen is at the bottom of Arabia, and it borders Saudi Arabia and Oman, a country right here. And it's on, if you go across the ocean a little bit, then there's Somalia and Africa, right?
Right.
So this is a very important place for Saudi Arabia because this is where their ports are. It's on the ocean, right? And that's meaningful for them. So they obviously have a national interest. I don't agree, but in the world of geopolitics,
Right.
in the realist school of thought, of course, they have a national interest of, how Yemen's doing, what it's like there, who's in charge, or are they going to bend to the will of Saudi Arabia if they want to, etc. So they have an interest on who's in charge of Yemen. So this is when they decide, let's put this guy named Mansour Hadi, who was the vice president to the dictator, Abdullah Saleh, at that time. Let's put him in power. So they hold an election in Yemen, and the US sponsors it. And there's one name on the ballot. So it's not an election. And of course, Hillary Clinton called this the advent of Yemeni democracy. Of course, we love it. So yeah, they hold an election, they put this guy in charge, and obviously he just turns out to be just yet another dictator. He's supposed to hold election again in 2 years. He doesn't. He continues to kind of wage this little war, this little civil strife between the Yemeni government and the Houthi faction in the north, which, by the way, it's kind of the same deal with how we treat the drone strike, right? The drone war. So the more that they try and push the Houthi or antagonize them, the stronger that they get, the more they want to fight back, etc. Right. So it's just like, whenever you're using violence to get to the end of your means, it's just not going to work. So basically that's what's happening right after the Arab Spring. And funny enough, Abdullah Saleh actually goes and joins the Houthis, which kind of makes no sense because it turns out he actually used to be from that area, and I believe he was a Shia Muslim. So he joins. I think he dies a couple of years later. He kind of ends up not being that important. Right, so we're in Arab Spring 2011. So that continues on, a little internal strife between them and the Houthi. And then what happens is the Houthi come at the very end of 2014, and they take over the capital of Yemen. And the Mansour Hadi, who was president, obviously, he flees to Saudi Arabia. And he's been in Saudi Arabia ever since 2014. He's basically on house arrest there. He has not been back to Yemen. And it's long past his time to be president anymore anyways. Long past, right? So they take over the capital. And at this time, the US, they're still, fighting their war against Al-Qaeda in Yemen. And they're not too concerned with the Houthi taking over the capital. In fact, at this time, they're trying to have a peaceful transition of power. Maybe not peaceful is the correct word, but a workable transition of power so that the Houthi can, take over so that they can continue their drone war against Al-Qaeda. That's really their main concern, right? And so for a couple months, they actually are fine with the Houthi taking over, essentially. And they have somewhat of an intelligence relationship with them. They're sharing intelligence back and forth, and they know that the Houthi are also an enemy to Al-Qaeda, right? They know that they're a proper ally to go against Al-Qaeda because, number one, they're Shia and Al-Qaeda is Sunni. And that's just a blatant thing for people of the Al-Qaeda ideology, right? Just a very radical ideology. And actually the Houthi formed as a political faction back in the day because Saudi Arabia was exporting its radical form of Islam called Wahhabism, which is what Al-Qaeda ascribes to that area, that region of Yemen, because they border it. So that's actually why the Houthis formed in the very first place, is because they're forming against this new radical ideology that was coming to their region from Saudi Arabia. So they're a great ally of the US. If the US wants to fight Al Qaeda in Yemen, okay, sure, great. Now you have a new ally. I'm not sure why you would care so much about who's in charge, essentially, as long as they're giving you what you want, right?
Right.
But of course not. So what happens is a couple months later, even though we have this fine relationship with them, Washington is supposedly, according to certain reports, etc., is fine with them taking over. Saudi Arabia, however, is not fine with that. They want their puppet dictator in power. They want their person in power. And so in 2015, this is when we have like the official launch of this Yemen war. So all of that is context of like how we've been involved there, which I think is really important. But now we have the official launch of the war. So Obama launches this war in coalition with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And it's supposedly to return Mansour Hadi to power as like the rightful ruler of Yemen. Right. But what's interesting is it's consistently foreign power in Yemen rather than Yemeni. Like it's not a civil war. It's not. That's what's really interesting about it. So the US at this time, they backed the launch of the war with full US support. And Obama said, like, we give full US support. It's like a blank check for them. And full permission as well. I mean, ultimately we are the empire, and so countries really do need somewhat of a permission, especially if we run that country, or if that country is our client state like Saudi Arabia. They essentially need our permission to do whatever they're going to do.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, you're fine. You're
people
fine.
coming to the room.
All good.
So let's see, where do I want to go from here?
If you don't mind, one thing I might
Yeah.
and I think Scott talks a lot about it, is one of the incentives behind why Obama backed the Saudi Arabians in that war with Yemen has partly to do with the Iran deal, correct? Where Obama, he had signed the Iran deal, the nuclear deal, and that pissed off a lot of the Saudi Arabians because they have conflict with Iran. And so Obama, in his own words, said to placate the Saudis, will back their war in Yemen, which just ultimately means that in order to placate their nuclear deal, they're going to support just the complete genocide of this like these people in this country.
Right, exactly. I want to find this quote real quick because I just think it's so important. Let's see. There's countless quotes from Obama administration officials literally saying like this war has nothing to do with what's good for Yemen. This has to do with us helping our allies with what they want, or like you said, placate the Saudis while pursuing the Iran nuclear deal. I don't know if I'll be able to find it.
That's all right.
But anyways, there's countless quotes about how, like I said, this isn't essentially what's good for Yemeni policy. It's just what we need to do for our allies. There wasn't much debate around whether we were going to do it or not. Like, just almost like no thought behind, and no clear explanation, and no clear path of like what this war is for, what they're wanting to accomplish, why exactly they're doing it. And I just think that's just like a perfect example of just how messy our foreign policy is, and our invention is. Like, the idea that the US really is on this crusade to help the world is just so nonsensical. And I don't know who the heck is believing it anymore. I just don't understand how you can believe that anymore. If you really know anything, if you really just read the news in like any form and just not watch what's happening on TV or like follow some silly influencer, right? Like, it's right in front of your face. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to think that the US has its own incentives to do what they do. Like, I just don't understand how we could be so naive at this point when it's all right in front of our faces. So they wage this war, and the US is intricately involved. I feel like people will try and pretend like the US is just like kind of helps here and there, or they're just not stopping it or whatever. No, we run the entire logistics of the war. That means we run the war. And I'm not like huge on like military lingo and things like that, but I do know enough to know that that's what logistics means. We
Right.
give them the intelligence, we know the targets, etc. We run the logistics, that's everything. We also run the maintenance, right? So a lot of people know, if they kind of follow this conflict, that if we didn't help the maintenance on like Saudi planes, they wouldn't be able to do all their airstrikes that we do. We could ground them in like a week if we really wanted to. We hold all the leverage to end the war. And then we also are in charge of obviously all the weapons sales. And Saudi Arabia, I think, is the world's biggest consumer of weapons sales, or became that during the Yemen war. And I actually wrote this in my article, if I can find it. Let's see.
And I'll make sure we link your article in the show notes, so that way people can go read it, because it's not a complex article. Like, that's what I loved about it, is it takes you maybe if 5 minutes.
It's 800 words.
Yeah, it's super easy.
And that's why I wanted to give the context. I don't give any context in the article, but the simple stuff is in the article 100%. But yeah, from 2015 to 2020, the US sold over $64.1 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia, making them the world's largest arms importer. We provided intelligence sharing, logistical support, etc. So it's just craziness. So we really do run everything. And Saudi Arabia is more or less our client state. So they're going to do what we say. We have that leverage to end it. So what has this war created? The world's worst humanitarian crisis. I'm sorry, I think there's a little kid trying to get in the door.
No
I'm at my fiance's family's house, and there's like 12 children. So it's created the world's worst humanitarian crisis. It's been going on for 7 years, since 2015. It's shocking that it still hasn't ended. And what's so important to note with Yemen is that this was the poorest country in the Middle East to begin with.
Wow.
The poorest country in the Middle East to begin with. They already struggle with food and water issues. Like, that's already a thing for them. And now they're dealing with daily airstrikes, 1/3 of which hit civilian targets. They've just been wiped by countless war crimes, and I'll kind of get into that because I think it's really important. But yeah, so basically there's an air raid from Saudi Arabia, and then there's a ground war happening with the UAE. So to kind of break that down, like I said, 1/3 of the airstrikes from Saudi Arabia are actually hitting civilian targets. And there's a lot of studies that have been done that this is all deliberate as well. Yeah. They're going down just a list of national infrastructure of what to hit. So they're hitting everything from like water and sewage works, hospitals, civilian apartment buildings, refugee camps. They literally deliberately bomb everything they can with the food distribution process. They're bombing farms, they're bombing everything. Anything that you can think of that a civilian would use, they bombed it. And so that's just making it impossible for them to have any type of production system. Obviously, their economy is just wiped. 80% of the population in Yemen right now is starving. 80%. That's insane. That's insane. And to think that, for me, like, it's been actually really difficult and hard on my heart to see that when I log on to my Canva profile on my Google, I see outreach for Ukraine. When I go on my Instagram, I immediately see little stickers on my thing where I want to put a sticker on my Instagram story, and it's all for Ukraine. And I'm just like, no one even knows that Yemen exists, I'm pretty sure. And 80% of the population is starving there. I don't care if it's a US war or not. This is a huge humanitarian crisis, and nobody's talking about it. You know what I mean? Like, if this were happening anywhere else, I feel like this would just be such a huge topic of conversation. Whether the US is involved or not, it should be a huge topic of conversation. It should be everywhere. Why would the news not be covering this every single day? This is literally the worst thing that has happened in the world, probably in 20 years. I can't think of anything worse. I mean, I haven't been alive that long, but Iraq, yes, was horrible, but what's happening in Yemen is so blatantly evil. I can't comprehend it.
Right.
And then on the ground, what's really interesting is US support for Al Qaeda now, right? So we actually still have a drone war against Al Qaeda still going on in Yemen. but in reality, we're supporting them as well.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of Al-Qaeda forces have joined UAE mercenary forces on the ground. So even if we are trying to drone them, they're being safely guarded because they just
Right.
join up with the UAE mercenary fighters, and the UAE just kind of pays them off. And then we're giving them all this sophisticated weaponry
Mm-hmm.
because now they're part of their forces, right?
Right.
And there's obviously been lots of war crimes as well with the UAE on the ground, things like rape, torture, murder. There's been cases of them literally burning people alive over spits, over open fires, like just disgusting things. A lot of cases of like war crimes with like within the prisons, like with POWs and things like that, and rape and things like that. And this is not to say that like the Houthi side of things is like all good and correct and right, and commit it right. They commit also war crimes as well, but that's not necessarily my concern. Whereas this is my country, this is my government, we are the superpower, and if we're to claim that we stand for like the liberal rules-based national or whatever international order, and yet we're committing atrocities that are just as horrible as maybe what the Houthis are committing as well, then what ground do we stand on? You know what I mean? Like that matters, especially because we're committing on such a larger scale as well, right? And the Houthi are from Yemen. They live in Yemen. They're Yemenis. The UAE, Saudis, and US are not. And so, yeah. So that's a little bit about war crimes, things like that. There's also a naval blockade on the country. So this is what's causing so many of the issues. It's because they can't get what they need. The US has on and off put the Houthi on their terrorist watch list, right? Which means that you can't get humanitarian aid easily to Yemen because of those things. So that's been a huge issue. The naval blockade in of itself, it needs to end. If that were to end, a lot of things would get better as far as like food distribution goes and things like that. But basically the World Food Program in 2021 warned that this could become the worst famine in modern history in Yemen. They are literally on the brink of a famine, and
that's insane.
Yeah, we hear nothing. It's horrible. And the other horrible thing is that most of the people that are being affected is children.
Yeah.
And more than that, it's children under the age of 5. There's been crazy breakouts of different diseases like cholera and diphtheria. And let's see, yeah, actually right here I have the numbers. So 10.3 million children are suffering from starvation. 30,000 children under the age of 5 die every year due to malnutrition related diseases.
God.
Craziness. So actually there was a figure as well that 60% of the people that have died in Yemen, violent or non-violent, are children. Yeah, it's craziness. Like the more I read, I just can't believe it. Let's see, I wanted to cover a couple other things while I'm on the topic. Oh yeah, that's what I wanted to cover, is some Al-Qaeda stuff. But yeah, so just that context back to like, why are we here in the first place for Al-Qaeda? It's just so interesting because there's an expert who is from a certain foundation, and I can say it later, but I honestly can't remember, and it's on my notes, who talked about how Al-Qaeda is more powerful now. Oh, look, here it is, actually. So, okay, it was a reporter that was in Yemen, in Makalla, and he says, the emergence of Al-Qaeda is the most striking unintended consequence of the Saudi-led military intervention in Yemen. A campaign backed by the US has helped Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula to become stronger than at any time since it first emerged almost 20 years ago. There was actually a mini state created by Al-Qaeda in the eastern part of Yemen.
Wow.
So, and this is, mind you, all during the time that ISIS has its mini caliphate in Syria and Iraq. And there's a mini caliphate happening as well by Al-Qaeda in Yemen with a port city of over 500,000 people. They had different laws there. They had little propaganda campaigns. Like, wow, that's happening during this war, because number one, like you're creating instability. So it's just a perfect environment for them to rise and just do whatever they want. None of the focus is on them. You're also providing them with all the weapons that they need. Like it's mind blowing. It's mind blowing. So yeah, that's another just crazy outcome. And the problem too is, like I said, the stated outcome of the war was to have Mansour Hadi back in power, right? Because he was the elected president. He's long past when he would ever be elected. He hasn't been to Yemen since. The Houthis have been running the country for 7 years, essentially. And just any stated outcome of the war is just no longer feasible. It's just truly not. I don't even understand why they're continuing on with this. And because they've created so much instability, if things were to end, more likely the biggest outcome that would happen is that either the Muslim Brotherhood would take over the capital or Al Qaeda would take over the capital. And that's the situation that we're in right now. So the whole thing's just a mess.
It's amazing because, I mean, there's so many different things you could look at. I mean, the fact that, as you mentioned, they're deliberately targeting the infrastructure of the country to cripple everybody. And then they put a blockade and they know that it's not like, oh, we're just discovering like, oh man, maybe there's time to hurry and reverse it. No, they've been doing this continually after the reports have come out that these children and children dying of basic diseases and malnutrition I can't think of a more evil act there's no justification in my mind for any sort of military conflict, strategic move to starve children under the age of 5 and then continually hold that blockade. And it's funny because one of the things that I don't think people really understand is that, and you alluded to this early on when we started talking about it, is it's not just one president, it's not one party, it's not one group. We've seen this from, Obama was the one who launched it. Trump, I believe, had the opportunity. I think there's a resolution to officially end the war in Yemen, and he
War Powers
vetoed
Resolution 1973, and he
Yep.
vetoed it.
And
Crazy that they were able to pass that.
yeah, when will they ever do that again?
And he vetoed it.
Yeah, so it's not like Trump. Maybe he didn't start a lot of new wars, or there's a lot of things people say to make the case that he's not the worst military president that there's been. But he didn't. He had the chance to, and he rejected the opportunity to stop this war. And then one thing I wanted to, maybe you could go into a little bit of detail about is Biden. There was some promise and some hope that Biden was going to stop the war. He even said, I think he was going to stop the offensive operations and only focus on defensive measures. Right? Is that correct?
Right.
And what has that amounted to?
Nothing. He's in fact escalated it.
Right.
Yeah. The Houthi did a strike. They've done a couple strikes, I think in the past as well, against Saudi Arabia, like strike back on their own land, right?
Right.
And then just recently they did a strike in the UAE, and I think they killed a couple people, which obviously any innocent life that's taken is horrible and wrong.
Right.
But I don't know what you would expect when you're at war with a country and it's been fought completely on their own terrain and they start to fight back. And in response to them striking the UAE, Biden wants to claim that they're terrorists, which is just the most comical thing I've ever heard in my entire life. I'm confused. I just don't understand. So in response, he's decided to escalate the war instead. So of course, it didn't live up to his promise.
Quite the opposite.
Quite the opposite. Exactly. It's really, really disappointing because I remember even just back in September, like being really excited because I actually thought things were going to come to an end or something was going to change or things were going to get better. The only thing that's happened that's seriously an amazing thing is that there's somewhat of a ceasefire happening now.
That is exactly what I wanted to finish up this kind of topic with, is just in the last week, right? These are new unfolding events. So go ahead. I'm sorry to cut you off again. Go ahead and explain that.
No, you're fine. I just read a couple days ago on it. So far it's been going good, which I think is a little bit surprising for everyone. I think we'll just have to see if it like continues on. I'm sure that there's still low scale violence and things like that. But just according to, I haven't read enough about it to be honest, but according to the article I read a couple days ago, it's been going pretty good. And there technically really is a ceasefire. And hopefully this will just, and it's supposed to last 2 months. So Ramadan is only 1 month, but it's supposed to last 2 months. And they're just hoping that this is an opportunity where they can maybe try and come back to the table and negotiate something, just like while tensions have gone down. And I really, really, really hope that's how it goes. And maybe this really actually could be something big, or this could be just a small hiccup and then things just go back to how they were. When I told my fiance about the ceasefire, he kind of just laughed and was just like, they're not gonna uphold that. Like, that's just not gonna happen. So I don't know. I tend to always go towards the optimistic side.
I mean, it's important to maintain the optimism, because in the midst of every single conflict you could go off about, there's more than enough reasons to remain pessimistic. And I guess you would say I just forgot the word optimistic point is, and I don't know if you read it today. I was reading, it said that I think Hadi officially stepped down today. There's an article that said he's no longer the president, and that they are now having an interim council or something like that. Let me pull it up, because I thought it was
I haven't read that
interesting.
one, but I feel like I got a hint of something like that. But yes, I knew something about him finally like officially stepping down.
Mm-hmm. And it was saying, what's that?
Which you should have done long ago, or officially was done long ago.
I think it's like, I think I read there's supposed to be 2-year presidencies, and he's been obviously, like you said, well over.
And then elections, and
So the article that I was reading today, it says President Hadi's 2-year term in office has finally officially come to an end, with an agreement to hand over power to a temporary leadership council. This is raising hope for the peace process, as Saudi Arabia committed $2 billion to the new council, said the UAE chipped in another $1 billion, and the two sides are calling on the council to start negotiations to end the war. So those are just the first 2 paragraphs. It's
I need to read that.
Yeah, it's on antiwar.com. It was the top article, but now it's bumped down to maybe the 3rd. But it's interesting, because I feel the same way. Part of me wants to be optimistic and say, holy wow, that's amazing that there's a ceasefire, and they might be coming to a head on something. And apparently Hadi's stepped down. That's a big deal, right? But it is a little interesting to see that the UAE and Saudi Arabia, they're funding like billions of dollars into this new council. Is it really going to amount to anything? It's hard to tell.
It just continues the issue in a way, because ultimately, like, for things to really end in Yemen, where as far as like this war goes, is they need to be able to be in charge of their own destiny, right? They have to have their own self-determination. And the idea that the UAE and Saudi Arabia are still going to be intricately involved in the affairs just means that if they don't get what they want, they're just going to continue on with their raid and with their war. Right. And so ultimately, it's not going to be up to the Yemeni people. And ultimately, I'm sure the Houthi are still going to not want to back down either, because the problem in the first place is they don't want what the Saudis or the Emiratis want, or they don't want the same old dictator in power that's just going to continue to go back to war with them, because it's the same thing. Like, they got rid of Saleh, and the Houthi didn't like Saleh, and then they just put a new guy in, and he just continued his own civil war with the Houthi. So it's just like, it's so disappointing. And obviously I would never expect dictatorships like Saudi Arabia or the UAE to like try and just be hands off and laissez-faire with their neighboring country. And so it's difficult. Like, obviously, I would hope for the best. I guess I would just say, like, the best thing that could happen is just that the US gets out and the US puts some sort of pressure on Saudi Arabia, but ultimately that we just get out. We stop any support that we have. We do a PR campaign against them. Like, we switch hands, even though it's shady and snaky and we're the problem in the first place. I would be fine if we stepped back, did a PR campaign against the Saudis, tried
Mhm.
to, unravel all the things that we did that were wrong, and just completely got out of there, and then just allowed them to deal with it, I guess. Because without us, they wouldn't be able to wage such a harsh war. They truly wouldn't. And
Exactly.
without our support, they obviously wouldn't, from like a publicity standpoint. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's yeah, it's
I,
crazy.
I wonder, and again, I really do appreciate your optimism, and I hope that I can take on more of it, because there's a part of me that just remains a lot of the pessimism towards like the fact that, as you pointed out, there is now there is a significant Al Qaeda presence and faction that's developed in that country, and that to me alone is like a sign that even if this war ends, even if they get the ceasefire to be permanent, and let's say, Saudi Arabia or whoever gets in control and things chill out. Well, the fact that there's Al Qaeda there, I can totally see that as the pretext for the US to say, well, we can't leave. We can't leave until we
Yeah,
take care of the Al Qaeda faction that, oops, it was an unintended consequence of our
right,
war that
right.
we helped build that, but now we have to be responsible and help take care of it. And then it's
It's
I,
just a never-ending cycle.
right.
No, I'm with you there. I mean, I do agree. I think that the only way that we could get to a point where it's kind of like maybe like Afghanistan, you know, we're
Mhm.
finally, but even still there, we have sanctions, which is
Yeah.
my next article actually. So we're actually still completely involved there.
Right.
But just getting to the point of like, okay, it's so messy and enough people know about it that actually we do need to like scale back and stop whatever we're doing there and pull back and just be done. I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's the problem with the Middle East, is that we've created so many problems. It feels so difficult to pull out of anywhere, even
Right.
though that's of course what we should do. But they always can come up with a new reason to be here because they've created so many issues that they have so many issues that they now need to fix,
Right. Exactly. And
which
it's
will
just like,
create more, and then it's just like a never-ending cycle.
yeah, they just it's a self-licking ice cream cone. They just keep
Yes,
making their own
yes,
reason for their presence. And it's funny because to kind of like wrap this into the broader context of the world, that's why, and I'm sure a lot of people may have seen or even rolled their eyes at, people like us who, as Russia has been invading Ukraine and that whole tragic conflict that's been going on, that again is largely a result, if not all a result of US intervention. But
yep,
you can see why people like, say Putin and other leaders do not take the US seriously, because they look at it and say, now all of a sudden you've got George Bush and Condoleezza Rice and all of these other architects and leaders that were responsible for the invasion and quote unquote liberation of the Middle East, saying, "Oh, how awful and how evil is it that that Putin would invade a sovereign country." And it's amazing, because as someone who follows even the limited knowledge that you might have, but who follows the history of the US in the Middle East or any of these other countries, you see that they're no better. And the irony is that they're actively, conducting and supporting countries that are doing, I I mean, and I will probably get flack for this, but I would say what is going on in Yemen or even Palestine is worse than what's been going on in Ukraine,
I agree.
because countless innocent people are being killed in Ukraine, but the US is actively starving and blockading and just destroying. I mean, because you can make the case that Putin and the Russian military has not been just absolutely leveling Ukraine. It's been more
No,
targeted, and it's been escalating more, you could say, but they haven't just completely destroyed the infrastructure and caused,
yeah,
these people to starve to death and just die of basic disease. And so it makes this
and to what end
whole,
too? What
yeah,
purpose?
exactly.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the argument is easily made that Yemen is obviously worse,
Mhm.
obviously worse than what's happening in Ukraine.
Right.
You can even look at Iraq and say the same. We went in
Mhm.
there and we just carpet bombed Iraq. We
Yeah.
just like literally like I can't remember exactly what it said, but I read this article the other day that just was saying like what we did in Iraq in the first day is worse than what Russia has done in Ukraine in the first month. And neither is justifiable, but it's significant.
Yeah.
When you claim to be the arbiter of truth and democracy and freedom and goodness and whatever it is, then like you have to take a greater look and see what does that really mean, because that's not actually what you represent at all whatsoever. But yeah, it is really wild, and I think that it's totally okay to claim that what's happening in Yemen is 100% worse and 100% deserves attention, if not more attention, and has been deserving of attention for 7 years. So
Right.
it's really disheartening to see, and it really just goes to show just like how manipulated we really are with our media and our culture and all of it, because truly none of us, and it's difficult because I think sometimes people will make the argument like, well, Yemen's a little bit more confusing because it's like also like a civil thing, and we also don't understand fully like the inner workings, and whereas like Russia, it's just like simple, like they invaded their neighbor. And like to an extent that is true, I guess, as far as like the public being able to digest it easier in a way, also because it's European. But at the same time, Yemen isn't that complicated. It's truly not. I understood that concept pretty easy. And once you just know like a tiny bit of history, watch like a 15-minute video, I feel like you're good to go. You understand Yemen. And I would argue too that what's happening with Russia and Ukraine isn't as simple as Russia invaded its neighbor. Just trying to recreate the Soviet Union or whatever narrative they're pushing, right? Like everything has intricacies, everything has nuances. So the idea that one should have more attention than the other because it seems more simplistic is just silly to me.
Yeah, no, it's really frustrating to have to constantly be that person who tries to point out to people like, I understand the concern with, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, but you have to understand why no one takes the US seriously. When you get outside of Western media and you get outside of the US, and I'm saying this as someone who's never even been to the Middle East or been to any of those other countries, but once you look at just the simple details and look at it from outside of what our Western media shows us, you realize that there's great reason not to take the US leaders seriously and to not,
absolutely,
their word is as any kind of valid promise or something to be even feared, I guess. So it's really frustrating, but I'm glad to find that there's, constantly more people talking about this issue, and it's not just within the same, Scott Hortons, the Dave Smiths, the same group of people. Like, I really am ecstatic to find that even from my own state, there's another person that's harping on these issues and bring attention. And I felt like, what can I do is at the very least is bring attention to your name from the few people that do follow and watch the work that I do, and really it's not like I do any work. I just rehash out and just act as a funnel for other people to talk about these issues. And so thank you so much for taking the time. I want to be respectful.
Yeah, thank you.
And make sure that I don't take up your whole night, because it's late over there. You're in Jordan, so you're on a completely different time zone. So where can people follow you, Quinn? Where can they follow your work and any social media plugs that you have? Go ahead and just, listen.
Yeah, honestly, I'm on Twitter at Quinn Driggs 1, but I'm never on Twitter. I just retweet. But really everything I do is on Instagram. So definitely follow me on Instagram. It's Quinn R Driggs. And that's where I talk about all of my stuff. Give me a follow. And then I'm trying to think. I write at basedpolitics.com. So based-politics.com. It's a really, really good little news outlet. And also they have a podcast as well called Based Politics. So those are pretty much the two places. But yeah, I'm glad that we were able to talk about this. And it's nice to see how many more people are also like receptive to our ideas as well. And once people are just a little bit educated, like I think they care, they just don't know. No one's just teaching them. No one's like getting that word out. And so I think that's why it's really cool that people like you are trying to do that. So
yeah, well, thank you so much. It's really been awesome to have this conversation and just listen to you lay out the basic context of everything. And I'll make sure to link all of the the plugs that you just listed in your article and everything in the show notes. That way people can follow you easily. Quinn, are there any final thoughts, any last words that you want to leave before we wrap up, or do you feel like you've said everything you need to say?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. Awesome. Great. Well, everybody who's listened to this point and has followed along, even if you haven't, I promise you, if you just go, you can listen to it again, go read Quinn's article, go read, Scott Horton's book, just do a little bit of research and put in a little effort, and it will come together. I felt like I would never understand these things, and I'm sure for Quinn it was the same for you. But as soon as you invest a little bit of time, it clicks, and then you can really see the broader context and follow along what's happening. So thanks again everyone for tuning in, and until next time, have a wonderful evening.